These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service and NPR affiliate of Winston-Salem State University, welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, Loaded, a disarming history of the Second Amendment with Dr. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. Africa World Now Project is next.
We are the Halusa Nation. Our DNA is of earth and sky.
According to Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, in an article entitled Settler Colonialism and the Second Amendment in Monthly Review, which is adapted from her recently published book, Loaded, a Disarming History of the Second Amendment, Professor Dunbar-Ortiz points out that in a book published in 1876, but written decades earlier, historian Joseph Doddridge, a minister and early settler in the Ohio country, wrote, "The early settlers on the frontiers of this country were like the Arabs of the deserts of Africa, in at least two respects. Every man was a soldier, and from early in the spring till late in the fall was almost continually in arms. Their work was often carried on by parties, each one of whom had his rifle and everything else belonging to his war dress. The Second Amendment thus reflects this dependence on individual armed men, not just in terms of the right to bear arms, but also as a requirement to bear arms, which is crucial to the integrity of the state and the conception of security achieved through a relationship between state and citizen. In 1783, the British withdrew from the fight to maintain sovereignty over their 13 colonies, not due to military defeat, but rather in order to redirect their resources to occupy and colonize South Asia. Britain's transfer of its claim to Indian country west of the colonies spelled a nightmarish disaster for all indigenous peoples east of the Mississippi, and ultimately all of North America that would be claimed and occupied by the United States. Britain's withdrawal in 1783 opened a new chapter of unrestrained racist violence and colonialization of the continent. The creation of the U.S. Constitution began in 1785, but the document was not approved by all states and in effect until 1791. Meanwhile, the interim Continental Congress got to work on a plan for colonization over the mountain range. The Land Ordinance of 1785 established a centralized system for surveying and distributing land, with seized native lands being auctioned off to the highest bidder. The Northwest, referring to the Ohio Country Ordinance of 1787, set forth a colonization procedure for annexation via military occupation, transforming to civilian territorial status under federal control, and finally, statehood. These were the first laws of the incipient republic, revealing the motive of those desiring independence. It was the blueprint for the taking of the North American continent, with lines of future settlement reaching the Pacific on the maps. The maps contained in the land ordinances, which laid land in marketable square-mile plots, were not new. They were the products of pre-revolutionary colonial elites, including George Washington, who, as a leader of the Virginia militia, took armed surveying teams illegally into Ohio country, making him one of the most successful land speculators in the colonies. The wealthiest colonists were all speculators. Acquiring land and enslaving people provided the very basis of the economy of the first nation born as a capitalist state, and by 1850, it was the wealthiest economy in the world. The Anglo-American settlers' violent break from Britain in the late 18th century paralleled their search and destroy annihilation of the Delaware, Cherokee, Muskogee, Seneca, Mohawk, Shawnee, and Miami, during which they slaughtered families without distinction of age or gender, and expanded the boundaries of the 13 colonies into unceded indigenous territories. The Declaration of 1776 symbolizes the beginning of the, quote, Indian Wars and, quote, westward movement that continued across the continent for another century of unrelenting U.S. wars of conquest. That was the goal of independence, with both the seasoned Indian killers of the Revolutionary Army and white settler militias using extreme violence against indigenous non-combatants with the goal of total domination. Nevertheless, these forces were met with resistance movements and confederations identified with leaders such as that of the Delaware, Alexander McGillivray of the Muskogee Creek, Little Turtle and Blue Jacket of the Miami-Shawnee Alliance, Joseph Brant of the Mohawk and Corn Planter of the Seneca, as well as the Great Tecumseh and the Shawnee-Lad Confederation in the Ohio Valley. Without their sustained resistance, the intended genocide would have been complete. The eastern half of the continent was ethnically cleansed of native nations by 1850 through forced relocation to Indian Territory west of the Mississippi. Before the Civil War ended, slave codes prohibited enslaved Africans from owning guns. After President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and after the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution abolished institutionalized slavery and the Civil War ended in 1865, states persisted in prohibiting freedmen from owning guns under laws renamed Black Codes. They did so on the basis that blacks were not citizens and thus did not have the same rights, including the right to keep and bear arms protected in the Second Amendment to the Constitution, as whites. This view was specifically articulated by the U.S. Supreme Court in its infamous 1857 decision in Dred Scott v. Sandford to uphold slavery. To understand a long history of ensuring black, indigenous, and poor folk from owning arms, all one has to do is look at the various laws and codes enacted by various states. Today, Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui and Dr. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz further explores the disarming history of the Second Amendment and its relationship to Africa and people of African descent. Having grown up in rural Oklahoma, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, the daughter of a tenant farmer and part Indian mother, has been active in international indigenous movements for more than 4 decades and is known for her lifelong commitment to national and international social justice issues. After receiving her PhD in history at the University of California at Los Angeles, she taught in the newly established Native American Studies program at California State University, Hayward, and helped found the Departments of Ethnic Studies and Women's Studies. In 1971, the book The Great Sioux Nation was the fundamental document at the first International Conference on Indigenous Peoples of the Americas, held at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva. Professor Dunbar-Ortiz is the author or editor of several other books, including Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, Blood on the Border, Memoir of the Contra War, Roots of Resistance, A History of Land Tenure in New Mexico, and Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment. She currently lives in San Francisco, California. Today's program was executive produced by Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, and as always, in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Brazil, Colombia, Kenya, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Enjoy the program.
The people see the spiritual in the natural through sense and feeling. Everything is related. All the things of earth and in the sky have spirit. Everything.
I'm here today with historian, author, memoirist, and speaker Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I know you've been traveling across the country discussing your most recent book, Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment, which was released in early 2018. Loaded is a timely and significant text on the history of gun culture and how it reflects race, gender, and power in the United States. Your book peels back the myths around the Second Amendment's right to bear arms and exposes the connections between arming the earliest Anglo settlers, modern-day policing, and the persistence of white supremacy as a political force. And our understanding of U.S. gun culture, as Clarence Lusane wrote, must be linked to an understanding of the ideological, historical, and practical role of guns in seizing indigenous lands, black enslavement, and global imperialism. For our conversation today, I want to pivot a little bit and think about the relationships between indigenous and African-descended communities in terms of their resistance to these violent colonial processes and the ways in which they created new ways of life, of relating, and social organizations, particularly around land-based resistance movements. So let's just jump in, and I'm going to kind of ask you a very broad question and hoping that you can really map this out for us historically. So in the case of all settler colonialism and neocolonialism, land was and is a primary commodity. Nation, race, and gender and class converged in land in emerging nation space. Can you start by mapping that out for us historically and geographically in the Americas?
Yeah, the commodification that came along with capitalist settler colonialism is sort of distinctive among, in other colonial experiences, which are horrible and they're all genocidal. But specifically in settler colonialism, there's the, there's the hope that the people will just go away, so they can take the land for production, and people with imported people from the mother country, but also imported enslaved Africans. So this took root mainly in North America and in New Zealand and Australia, early British colonialism. Later they turned to, in Africa and India and other places, to indirect colonialism that is working through local, like the Raj in India. So in those cases they use the native people as labor, not necessarily enslaved, but bonded labor, like in South Asia, or in Africa even, just enslaving the peasantry to work, or bonding them. They don't even have to enslave them necessarily if they're there. But in the case of settler colonialism, where they want the land itself and not just the labor, it's an elimination of the native. So this is, really intentionally genocidal, and many methods of doing it, but mainly warfare, the kind of warfare that's counterinsurgent warfare that attacks civilians rather than any fighting forces in their villages, burning the crops, burning food storage, driving them out into the peripheries as refugees. And this then is like a 400-year project in North America. It took 400 years to take the whole continent, and in between there, at one point, the United States became independent and didn't really miss a beat of implementing even more without any kind of regulations from a mother country, implementing the same kind of settler colonialism and genocide. So the other side of that is, of course, the importation of enslaved Africans, the transporting, and this went on till the international slave trade was outlawed by Britain and then others. It still continued, but fewer, more expensive and fewer, and it was illegal. But slavery was still legal. Slavery in Britain, slavery everywhere was still legal, just not the transatlantic slave trade. Thanks to, the British Anti-Slavery Society and Africans themselves, have resisting enough to, that the moral consciousness is affected. But in the United States, they were very unhappy about that. But just set about using the South Carolina and Virginia colonies as really slave production colonies, reproduction. And there's so many aspects of gender violence that intersect with all of this, particularly that kind of using African women as already, born in the United States, enslaved African women as reproduction machines, for the Cotton Kingdom to supply. So this really hideous practice went on, up until the Civil War, so like 70 years of that kind of, and then the brutality, the super brutality, you might say, of the Cotton Kingdom enslavement, where there was no longer, say, any possibility for having a family, because it was truly a commercial venture, and the very bodies of Africans, enslaved Africans, were a commodity that the total of which, this is extraordinary. These are some studies that have come out only in the last 2 or 3 years. The information was always there, but no one had really, I think, no historians had really wanted to see the extent of it and admit it. But Ed Baptiste and Walter Johnson and some other historians did that research, and they found that the total value of the capital that the enslaved bodies, the ownership of the property and African bodies, was greater than all other assets of the United States put together, including all gold and storage, all investments, all land, all the real estate, land, everything. That was how central slavery was to the development of U.S. capitalism. So I think unless we understand that, we don't understand the nature of capitalism as it has developed, because it did develop, most successfully, if you can use that word, in the United States, which, came to dominate the world economy and military and everything else. So the land, the taking of the land, the other end of genocide, of uprooting African people and enslaving them and transporting them so that they're sort of like Native people, thrown into a chaos of no longer being able to speak their languages, and after a generation or two, supposedly forgetting even where they came from, although we know that's not the case, that people do continue to tell stories, but that became harder and harder with the Cotton Kingdom for that kind of chain of oral history to take place, but it wasn't impossible. Now the connection of that with gun violence, which is the subject of Loaded, is you can't understand the gun violence or the gun proliferation or the meaning of guns to U.S. Americans without it being in that context, because it's completely out of bounds. It does not compare to any place else. So we have to, even in war zones, that there's 300 million firearms, and there are 300 million people in the United States. But only 30% of the 300 million people, that is 100 million, own even one gun. So that means that, and then 75% of those people, of that 30%, are white men that own the guns. And they own 8 to 10 on average. But that means, many people do just own one gun. So that means that, an arsenal of 40 or 50 guns is nothing unusual for this minority of people who hold the guns. So I think there's a demographic can be identified along with the white nationalism and racism that descendant, comes out of actual U.S. history, and even, as I showed in the Second Amendment, but also deeply in the Constitution itself, actually allows this to continue at some level, of suppression of knowledge, but also simply keeping the descendants of those peoples in a secondary position, and of course enriching a very small upper class. So then you have a populist democracy where every white man, by the Second Amendment, every white man had the right to kill Indians and chase down any fugitive slaves. They even had the responsibility to do that. And that was written into a Supreme Court decision, the Dred Scott decision, that every U.S. citizen was obligated to, if they saw a random black person, to check them out and check their papers, and if not, they had the duty to detain them and get them back to their so-called owners. So we have to, our present, I think what guns represent now for those descendants of those people who see themselves as white supremacists, as they should be in charge, that this country was set up for them. And, they're right historically. That's why we can't depend on historical precedents really for the freedom of oppressed people in this country. We have to really question the whole structure of everything. But first has to come the consciousness, and they're very conscious of the threat, they say, of white genocide, of being disappeared by brown and black people. But it's also I don't think they're really afraid of that. I think it's more the loss of power, because they've always been a minority. Whites were pretty much a minority of the whole period of U.S. history. It's just that with various resistance, the Civil War, the Marooning and Civil War, Native resistance, and all other kinds of social resistance, it has hammered away at and loosened up, reinterpreted the Constitution. But what we've seen since the Supreme Court decision to desegregate schools in 1953, we've seen an immediate reaction to that by white nationals organizing in hate groups, and now we've gotten to the point that almost all of those gains are being reversed, and like voting rights or the Indian Child Welfare Act or women's reproductive rights, and labor rights. The right to labor unions so restricted now that they can't even be effective, except workers having wildcat strikes, which maybe it's okay, but then the punishment is great. So we're going to have to really face that the Constitution is being reinterpreted by originalists, and although that's an ideology, they are right that that's what the founders meant. They meant it to be a white republic. There was no doubt about that. They meant to, even in freeing slaves, like they were all in this anti-slavery society, Hamilton and Jefferson and all of them. But that was to one day let the institution kind of cease to exist, and then to deport all of the black people supposedly back to Africa, but they hadn't come from Africa by then even. They were born here. So that forced deportation, and then of course the deportation of Native people to reservations, tiny parts of their land. And then I think, there's another important element that we're seeing played out now, but it's always been there, and that's the border issue, the taking of half of Mexico, and that really unstable and questionable legality of that border, because it was taken by force, with the occupation of Mexico City and the Marines and Texas Rangers holding everyone in authority hostage and unarmed until they signed a treaty of cession. And the threat was, we either take it all or you sign this and we'll take only half. So then you have, the situation of that fear of reprisal of Mexicans, because I think most Mexicans think of revenge factor. They come here for, for work and for many other things. I mean, with, the violence from U.S. Provoked drug wars, with a war on drugs. They've taken the brunt of it to fear, leave the violence or whatever. They're not thinking of, I'm going to go take revenge on the United States. But the white nationalist does think that's what I would do. I would want to take revenge. If someone they don't think this out, but this is their instinct, that they must be really hated, so they turn the hate around, and so they hate the people who've been victimized by this system. So this is, what's disturbing right now. When I started writing this book, I actually wrote it, wrote the first draft the summer of 2 years ago, leading up to the election. And watching, there were many horrible mass shootings during that time. Orlando, and the year before had been the Charleston. And so I was writing about these, but I was also watching the stadium speeches and the white nationalism, the Mexican hating, degrading Mexicans. They hadn't yet said shithole nations, but it was pretty clear that's what it was coming to. And it was really kind of scary, because I thought as a historian, I had worked this all out rationally as a historical analysis. I mean, it wasn't new. It was applying it, I did the Indigenous people's history of the United States and really laid out all that history, and then was kind of zooming in on the Second Amendment and beginning to look at the Constitution itself and the structure itself. I was seeing it all played out, in this revival, and I think I was taken aback, as many were, that this, such a person could exist. That we had George Wallace and all, but that such a person an individual could be elected, even though they didn't win the most votes, but by that slavery protection electoral college that still exists in the Constitution, that it was really pretty scary. And then when the book went into production in the fall of last year, I had, in the late summer, after the editing and and all that, it was finally going into production, and it was finished, and we had to delay the publication of the book to January. It was supposed to come out in the fall, because of the Las Vegas shooting, because I had said that the Orlando shooting of 48 dead was the largest number of people dead in a mass shooting of that type, civilian mass shooting, as it's defined, and in history. And I honestly, I thought I could say that.
We are the tribe that they cannot see. We live on an industrial reservation. We are the Halusa Nation.
We are currently listening to a recent conversation between Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui and Dr. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, where they are exploring the disarming history of the Second Amendment and its relationship to Africa and people of African descent. They situate their conversation in Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz's recently released book titled Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment, released earlier this year. Having grown up in rural Oklahoma, Professor Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, the daughter of a tenant farmer and part Indian mother, has been active in international indigenous movements for more than 4 decades and is known for her lifelong commitment to national and international social justice issues. After receiving her PhD in history at the University of California at Los Angeles, she taught in the newly established Native American Studies program at California State University, Hayward, and helped found the Departments of Ethnic Studies and Women's Studies. Her 1977 book, The Great Sioux Nation, was the fundamental document at the first International Conference on Indigenous Peoples of the Americas, held at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva. Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz is the author and editor of 7 other books, including An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, Blood on the Border, Memoir of the Contra War, Roots of Resistance, A History of Land Tenure in New Mexico, and Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment. She currently lives in San Francisco, California. Today's program was executive produced by Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, and as always in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Brazil, Colombia, Kenya, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Continue to enjoy the show.
It's defined and in history, and I honestly, I thought I could say that and be absolutely sure that it will never be more than that. That's a maximum. Mm-hmm. And sure enough, in Las Vegas, it's like 52. So I had to actually go change it, and it felt very sad, mm-hmm. that. I made no predictions after that. I said, left it open. This is so far, mm-hmm. for most people. But it's, in real time that this is happening. I feel like since Indigenous Peoples History of the United States came out in 2014, that I have traveled around a lot. That book kind of really took off, and it seemed to hit a nerve, especially with young people and young people of color in particular. And I got invited to speak in so many places. I was scheduling like a year ahead because my calendar would get filled, and I was supposed to be writing another book. Mm-hmm. That it was, but I couldn't stop. Of course, I could have said no, but I just felt this is a window of opportunity. People are really seeing things. But then I realized that parallel to that, of people waking up, that it even more so the fear on the part of white nationalists, and I'm not just saying these. People who go around with swastikas or the alt-right. I mean, the people who are in power, the U.S. Congress, the Senate, the Republican Party has become a white nationalist party. It's been becoming that for a long time. The Democratic Party was pretty much a white nationalist party up until the Civil Rights Movement. And so I think it's just it's really more important than ever that we step back from the kind of chaotic response of that Trump has the ability of charismatic dictators. I mean, it's hard to call him charismatic, but if you go look at the others, they're pretty swarmy too, but it's a fascination, even people who hate him can't take their eyes off of him and say, what's he going to do next? So that, in a way, pulls everyone into this sort of this eye of this storm, and I think we have to step outside of it and, do this historical analysis and understand that this was where we were heading. The only thing that's prevented it, the only bulwark against it, has been our resistance movements. Mm-hmm. And they've been terribly weakened, and the labor movement has been almost destroyed. But our movements have become very, in the 60s we had a thrust where, sure, there, in any social movements or any, social situation, there are always factions and divisions and people debating with each other, and that's as it should be. But on the whole, there was a massive expression of the rights of Native peoples to their land and sovereignty, the African American rights to total equality, and changing, implementing many of these things. So the Voting Rights Act was so important. It's gone now. So the gerrymandering has just reversed everything. And so I think I don't want to blame the victims or, the left like myself. I don't want to say it's our fault, but I think we have to see that we were crippled and diminished, by this real counter-revolution that came with this white nationalist movement that really began in the 1950s. The NRA is an example of becoming a white nationalist group, whereas it had been kind of a stupid thing, of an organization of mostly white guys who like to go kill little helpless animals and have, go out with their buddies and shoot things, and it is recreational, and then it was not a really big thing. I think it had the whole gun culture. I mean, there weren't any restrictions on guns. There weren't any at all, and there was no debate about guns. But people weren't really interested in them, the urbanized population. But then you had a civil rights movement, and within 20 years, in 1975, the NRA is taken over by a white nationalist organization that was formed in 1974 called the Second Amendment Foundation. Mm-hmm. And they actually got in and, took over the leadership of this nonprofit, dues-paying organization. So the NRA is a white nationalist organization now. It purposely is taken over and made into that. And it's just become more and more effective as it's gone along, and it hides behind, the rhetoric of gun safety training and, so forth. But it wasn't until the Second Amendment was seized upon as a white nationalist, and they're right about it. This is the thing, that is what the Second Amendment meant. It meant white male privilege of keeping African Americans, Mexicans, and Indians down. Basically continuing Jim Crow, because they didn't really need it. If you look at 1950, you look at the whole United States. To be more clear, because there were a lot of things going on with the war and the, segregation and the army and everything. But let's say 1940. At that moment in time, the United States was an absolutely locked down white republic, male and patriarchal. The Jim Crow was fully in effect in the South. They didn't need the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan had disappeared. They came back in the 1920s basically to harass the foreign-born and Catholics, and lasted, and they were really brought back by a surge of white nationalism with the Woodrow Wilson administration and the birth of a nation. I mean, it was a formula for acting out. But then it kind of disappeared in the South. It was more in the North, because in the South, the people who had been the Klan had before that been slave patrols, and then when they became illegal with Reconstruction, they put hoods on and continued their slave patrol activities illegally. And then with the shutdown of Reconstruction and the takeover, they no longer had to be the Klan. They were the police and the sheriffs, and the keepers of the prison work farms. So that's the that they didn't need the Klan, and to the extent it existed, it was mostly to keep African Americans segregated in northern cities as the diaspora took place. So the modern police force is really, its genealogy comes from slave patrols, which are the other thing the Second Amendment was about. It was about both the militias that are mentioned are those voluntary militias that control slaves and kill Indians. So they came out of the slave patrols developed in the 1680s, and out of the militias that had been established in the 13 colonies, as the colonies got founded, to drive out the native people and take their land. And so then they were in the colonies themselves, which had been ethnically cleansed. They were used then for slave patrols. So this, I think what this history indicates is that one of our problems in our movements is that we haven't developed, in not developing that historical analysis, we haven't developed the kind of strategic alliances that would, really create an authentic, united front around those commonalities of the history of oppression. As it is, we're kind of easily divided because there's multiculturalism sort of flattens everything and certainly doesn't include native people, and it reduces everything to racism, whereas it's much worse than just racism. It really is much worse because it's white supremacy. It's not an attitude or just the way people talk or bluster or whatever. It's actually a political ideology that is very precious to those who hold it, and everyone's infected with the racism that comes out of that. But not everyone is a white supremacist. It's a minority of people. They just happen to control everything at the moment after losing a lot of ground. Most of the states have these governors and legislators that are, sometimes I really feel like I live in a bubble in California. And it's mainly due to the fact that we have now a majority, mostly Mexican population, but it used to be Mexico, So it's we have a kind of resistance, to this reality, but not really the analysis. And no one is going to do this analysis unless we and the social movements do it ourselves. And I find a kind of laziness, of wanting to try this and try that, and then I have nothing against electoral politics, people participating in them. I don't mean just going to vote, but, really trying to push, especially local candidates and all. I think that's all great, and I don't even think we should be having that argument of electoral politics as if it means that and nothing else, that we have to really get to what the basic issues are and what we're up against, and also to just acknowledge openly, because I think people are ready for it. Not only are they becoming a majority of people sympathetic or feel an identity with socialism, sort of, broadly defined, but really we should name capitalism more as, and understand that it is, it props up the white nationalism, the white supremacy, and maybe affirmative action sort of was designed by the Nixon administration to get a little color into, to make it not so obvious, but you basically anyone can, a few, can try and become white. That is, they can become have that consciousness, and if they don't, they will be sort of spit out, But we do have our educational institutions, which are, our universities and campuses, and I was beginning to feel that they were being so taken over by corporate money instead of public funds that students would, and the grades and all of these things it seemed like that for a while. It was quietness, but there's such a surge of students now, high school, and so I think we need to really develop some way to educate. I do what I can, in writing this stuff and also getting out there and talking. And of course, there are whole organizations like the Red Nation, a Native organization, it's about 5 years old now, that is based in Albuquerque, that absolutely has this analysis, has it, that Native people have, basically that's the analysis I'm giving. It's a collective analysis of Native Americans' experience of the United States. But that makes it fundamental, that's the initial experience. And if you can make Native people invisible or disappear, or simply not, when you're dealing with electoral politics, not a significant constituency because of numbers, then, you don't have an analysis that's really going to change things. So I think now that we're in this crisis mode is exactly the time when people can learn.
Sure, and I wanted to go back. There's so many threads that you opened up for us, and one of the things that I actually wanted to kind of look at and talk about is these strategic alliances. So as you had mentioned before, a lot of Indigenous social movements, as well as Black social movements, Africana studies, Black studies, do have this historical analysis and the political imperative, and it's embedded in the articulation of the demands and the sort of beyond struggle that that Black social movements and Indigenous social movements are articulating. But I wanted to go back and look at these relationships and these histories of Indigenous and Africana and African-descended communities in the Americas, particularly around, like, we have these examples of the Seminoles, Maroon communities as well. Can you lay some of that relationship, those alliances out for us?
Well, it's so important. You probably remember being, a specialist in African American studies, how the literature coming out in the 60s and 70s, Genovese and Apteker debates over whether or not, the consensus was of liberal historians that it wasn't because something about enslaved Africans in the United States were not as unhappy as others, but because of this tight capitalist system of control and the cutting off of any contiguous borders, like Texas, like Spanish Florida, Mexican Texas, where Marooners could go and fight from, that they didn't resist except in small ways, or now and then escaping, or the Frederick Douglass story, just so few people, and then showing every uprising, slave revolt, as a total defeat, the Denmark Vesey or the Nat Turner. And again, now this is something Native people have, and I think African Americans have this memory of these uprisings, not whether or not they were successful, but the fact that they happened, that's something to celebrate and be proud of and honor. But this idea that it was a closed system. Well, it was a closed system, but it was a closed system in Haiti, too. Of course, they were a majority of the population, but they actually threw the French out and became an independent nation. They were an island. But what's left out is that Native resistance itself, east of the Mississippi, is almost always completely ignored. You do colonial history, and you may find out about this or that, but basically up until the mass removal of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and the mass removal that was more or less complete by 1850, there was constant resistance going on. And it wasn't like army to army. Native people didn't have armies. They were all guerrilla activities, civilians. They also tried to make Indians very warlike, and this was, maybe a tiny bit of it so for the plains, the mounted Native people of the plains, the Lakota, the ones in the Hollywood films. But in the East, it was, guerrilla warfare, women involved. Whole communities just as, resisting, like the Vietnamese in the Vietnam War. And they were Native people don't use that term marooning, but that's exactly what they were doing in Florida, is marooning. It's what they were doing in the dismal swamp, of South Carolina, North Carolina, that area. They were marooning, and they built institutions all along the former Mexican border that had gone into when Mexico became independent. There were marooners all over there. So they were constantly then making forays into, retaking their land and also building institutions that would allow others to escape and come in, and be free. So the Seminole Nation was founded in Florida as an entity. There was Seminole people that existed they're Muskogee people related to the Creeks who were very strongly resisted. Also the Shawnee up in the Ohio country, as they resisted as the United States got formed and came in. So when they were, yes, defeated, you could say, when they were overcome, they migrated to where the resistance was taking place. So basically, they all ended up in Spanish Florida resisting. So it was many, many nations made up the Seminole Nation. The common language they used was the Muskogee language. That was the language of the Seminoles and the Creeks. But that the Shawnee and the Wyandot and, you know, all the other people who came in, and the Africans, there were almost an equal number of self-freed, liberated, so-called fugitive, enslaved Africans in that population, as there were Native people. They built whole villages. They were kind of in the northern part of Florida, and then Andrew Jackson. You know, there's 3 wars against these people. 3 declared wars against the Seminole Nation from 1815 to 1858. 3 different wars to try to get them out of there. And Andrew Jackson led the first one, you know, the first war to, you know, get the Seminoles out. And it was still under Spanish control, and that what they basically did was overthrow the Spanish and annex Florida. And so when they did that, the Marooners, you know, the Seminole Nation, with the fugitive slaves, you know, there was always a multicultural nation. There were a lot of poor white farmers from Georgia also who joined them. It was a major long-term resistance, and they moved into the Everglades, which is impossible to get anyone out. Talk about marooning. I mean, that's beyond any other imagined marooning that could happen, and that's where they were able to survive and still exist to this day. You know, never made a treaty with the United States. But this resistance never appears as a multiracial, multinational resistance. And I don't think it really appears in African American history as slave rebellion. But I think it's one of the most important and long-term, endless, you know, I mean, it just went on and on and on until the Civil War, the last of Seminole Wars was 1858. Well, after the end of slavery, that was the main reason, actually, the U.S. government, Andrew Jackson, offered, once he became president, that they could, that the Indians, you know, they were understanding there were all kinds of different Native people there, but that the Seminole Indians could take the Everglades, have it as their own, if they would turn over all of the Africans among them to be restored to their, you know, put back on the slave market, because many of them had been born there, you know, I mean, there were generations, and they said no. This was Osceola, you know, that was a great leader who actually was from North Carolina, a native person from North Carolina, who went down to, you know, join. But there's also the Tuscarora resistance in North Carolina, that in the Dismal Swamp, that was un-African. I think that is often, or almost always, listed as a marooning spot for African Americans, enslaved African Americans. But then they don't include the Tuscaroras, who had first set it up as a... So the Native resistance and the slave resistance really were inseparable in that whole period of time. And there's It's not just African American scholars who don't put it together. It's also Native scholars who don't, because there is, a quotient of anti-Black racism in the Native community. That's kind of the fundamental racism in the United States, is anti-Black racism. And there's been, a separation of peoples so that it has been, it's changing because there's a whole new generation of scholars. But many are coming out of the West, west of the Mississippi, and looking at that, which only started, really it started really in the 1820s, but only after the Civil War did they do all-out search and destroy, genocidal war west of the Mississippi. So that, that's the William Katz. I don't know if you know this wonderful, he's very elderly now, but he's one of the few people, he's actually a public historian. Do you know his work called Black Indians?
Yes.
Yeah. So he's really one of the few,
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms. Email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Muizu Mutali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funda Ngunda, senior research, content contributor, and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior researcher and content contributor and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technology, and creative director is Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project is heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University. Shows are archived weekly on SoundCloud. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.
Yes. We are the Halusa Nation. We are the evolution, the continuation. We are the Halusa Nation. Our DNA is of earth and sky. Our DNA is of past and future.
The people, the people, the people, the people. The virus took on many shapes. The bear, the elk, the antelope, the elephant, the deer. The mineral, the iron, the copper, the coltan, the rubber, the coffee, the cotton, the sugar.